Our ancient ancestors, like most animals, experienced a wide variety of stressors. The stress of foraging for food, managing shelter from the elements, evading predators, coping with injuries or illness, and competing for status and mates in a tribe would have been constant sources of anxiety about survival. Biological processes co-evolved with the entire hominid family tree to prepare them to cope with these stressors. Among the coping mechanisms was what we now call stress. Stress is essentially an organism's reaction to a potential real or perceived threat. Work-related stress is a pattern of reactions that occurs when workers are presented with work demands not matched to their knowledge, skills, or abilities, and which challenge their ability to cope. This reaction originally evolved in our ancient past to serve adaptive coping functions with risk or danger. That is, stress exists to help us survive. In order to understand how an emotion that is commonly viewed so negatively began as a life protective process, and yet how it also threatens individual health, it is important to delve into the nature of stress. Stress spans both biological and psychological domains. At the biological level, when we experience or perceive a threat, whether physical or social, two interrelated systems in our body begin to respond. The first is an area of our brainstem and part of the central nervous system, known as the reticular activating system, or RAS. The RAS stimulates a biological state of alertness and readiness for action by signaling the adrenal glands to release hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These hormones activate our central nervous system to provide energy and a state of readiness for response. Furthermore, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis, involves the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal cortex, which react with releasing hormones such as cortisol. Cortisol downregulates stress-related chemicals, so they do not damage the body. Collectively, these biochemical reactions in the body stimulate a psychological state of alertness, readiness for action, and energy to cope with the potential threat. Thus, stress evolved as a survival function, but when not managed competently, it runs the risk of becoming a damaging physiological, emotional, and behavioral problem. When stress is viewed as a positive process, it is referred to as eustress. Eustress is usually the ordinary type of stress that is experienced as relatively moderate but helpful. For example, most people experience a degree of eustress prior to giving a public speech. Some people, however, experience extreme stage fright or anxiety, and such stress is experienced as highly negative and maladaptive. The speaker experiencing eustress is likely to be energized by the stress, which will translate into a more charismatic, present, and engaging presentation. In contrast, the person who only experiences extreme stress is likely to be distracted by their anxiety, focus on themselves rather than on the message, and perform poorly in a speaking situation. Stress is a double-edged sword in this regard. Thus, how someone adapts to stress depends on a variety of factors, including the severity of the stress and its duration. Severe or intense but brief forms of stress, such as witnessing extreme violence, being victimized by crime, or facing a near-death experience represent forms of acute stress. In contrast, more low-level, but nevertheless serious stresses experienced on a longer-term basis or duration represent chronic stress. Both acute and chronic forms of stress can create problems, ranging from post-traumatic stress syndrome to mere exhaustion and burnout. Under conditions of relatively ordinary or everyday stress, most people experience it primarily as a state of relatively mild and non-specific physiological arousal. Such arousal is at least somewhat subject to simple management through cognitive appraisal. That is, thinking about the meaning of one's feelings. That is, nonspecific arousal can be interpreted as excitement or anxiety, as anticipation or fear. When the arousal is particularly severe or prolonged, however, common emotional reactions to such burnout tend to be prolonged states of anxiety and depression. While stress clearly evolved as an adaptive response in our evolutionary past, in a modern societal environment, the nature of our everyday threats tend to reflect somewhat different sources of stress. Maslow proposed that we are motivated by a hierarchy of needs, ranging from fundamental needs to more symbolic and socially constructed needs. We are motivated most fundamentally by our physiological and safety needs, which may have been primary among our ancient ancestors. Today, however, developed societies have generally provided cultural mechanisms for managing physiological and safety needs. In such contexts, other motivations of love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization represent the majority of sources of threat. When our basic needs are fulfilled, we tend to be more driven to seek out, accumulate, and maintain our self-esteem, strong social and personal relations, status, and achievement. These motives are easily threatened on an everyday basis as well. In the contemporary employment context, obtaining a salary generally helps manage physiological and safety needs. But as people move from rank-and-file lower-level jobs into more professional or management-level types of jobs, the rewards tend to become more associated with self-actualization of one's potential, pursuit of leisure, achievement, and the symbols of status. The nature of threats that are experienced day in and day out are more likely to involve office politics and relative status and fairness in the pecking order of the workplace. Such stresses may not seem as significant as those of foraging for food or seeking shelter, but nevertheless become the driving force of many workers' lives once these more basic needs are secured. There are at least 5 major sources of stress in the workplace. First, there are those that are work intrinsic to the job, such as poor or hazardous working conditions, time pressures, overload, and so forth. Second, there are those aspects of one's role responsibilities in the job, such as role ambiguity and conflict, and lack of job control over one's role. Third, some stresses result from career development issues, such as over or under promotion, lack of job security, and thwarted ambition. Fourth, stresses often result from poor relationships at work, including tense or frustrating working relationships with peers, management, subordinates, and problems delegating or communicating responsibilities. Finally, the organizational structure and climate can cause stress through lack of autonomy and decision-making authority, overly restrictive expectations for behavior, office politics, lack of organizational justice, lack of feedback and openness of communication, and financial difficulties of the organization. The nature of stress is that it reflects a situation in which the challenges of a situation outstrip the personal resources for coping with those challenges. Thus, across these 5 sources of stress, 2 common threads are one's personal capacities and the challenges on those capacities. The Communications Workers of America Association identify these 2 types of job stressors as job control, or the degree to which an employee has control of their job content, and job demands, or the degree to which the job content or environment represent challenges that tend to outstrip the employee's capacity to respond. Job content stressors include factors such as lack of recognition and respect for work done, job insecurity, harassment and bullying, racism, and microaggressions, inadequate compensation, lack of advancement opportunity, and relative isolation from coworkers. Job demand stressors include job fragmentation, speed-ups, deadlines, fear of accidents, harmful workplace environment, surveillance, lack of training, and unnecessary paperwork. A relatively new source of stress in the workplace involves other aspects of communication, often amplified by various technologies of communication. Collectively, these can be understood as forms of technostress, or forms of stress resulting from the technologies of communication associated with work. Collectively, newer communications media have created a dilemma for organizations, sometimes referred to as the connectivity paradox, which is the use of communication technology that diminishes the perception of distance to colleagues, but simultaneously enhances expectations for constant connectivity for employees. On the one hand, the vast array of communication media have vastly increased the efficiency with which communications can be engaged, and the accessibility of employees to such interactions. On the other hand, however, they create new forms of stress in which employees feel increasing surveillance, pressure to respond quickly, to be accountable for all information in the organization, and to multitask across such media. Another form of stressful fallout from these technologies is the experience of information overload. Information overload represents a condition of a person's exposure to more information than can be competently managed or processed. Information is essential to any workplace context. But when information becomes excessive, it represents a situation in which an employee finds it difficult to sift through the data to see the types of patterns or answers that are needed for any particular task. Information overload is likely to grow as a problem, especially with the proliferation of knowledge workers. Communications technologies and computers have increasingly led us into an age of big data. In another ITC program, I discussed the nature of big data. Big data are information that share the following features: volume, velocity, variety, and variability. Big data are revolutionizing much of modern life, for good and bad. By one estimate, 90% of all information ever created was created in the last couple of years. From 2005 to 2020, it is predicted that the digital universe will double every 2 years. Finding ways of working in a context of excess information and multiple technologies for communicating such information represent complex and competing demands on an employee's attention. This means that worker attention becomes one of the scarce resources over which employees, management, and the broader organizational marketplace compete. This constant competition becomes one of the modern sources of potential stress in the workplace and in people's everyday lives. The personal, social, and societal costs of stress extend far beyond immediate health impacts. In 2016, Go and colleagues conducted a major statistical modeling of 228 studies in which they studied the economic and health costs of workplace stressors in the United States. Their model examined 10 potential causes of stress, including unemployment, lack of health insurance, exposure to shift work, long working hours, job insecurity, work-family conflict, low job control, high job demands, low social support at work, and low organizational justice. They found that about $115 to $185 billion in healthcare costs and more than 120,000 deaths per year are associated with and may be attributable to how U.S. companies manage their workforces. While unemployment and lack of health insurance were the most powerful predictors of stress-related mortality, low job control alone predicted 31,000 excess deaths. Job insecurity predicted 29,000 deaths, and exposure to shift work predicted 12,000 deaths. High-demand jobs accounted for $48 billion. Work-family conflict accounted for $24 billion, and low organizational justice accounted for $16 billion in excess healthcare costs. This is not just a problem of one ethnicity or nation. For example, research specifically on U.S. Hispanics finds that chronic stress is related to cardiovascular disease, stroke prevalence, diabetes, and hypertension, even after controlling for socio-demographic, behavioral, and biological risk markers. Data from Mexico's National Comorbidity Survey from the early 2000s found that 69% of Mexicans had experienced a traumatic event, and the population prevalence of PTSD was 1.5%, but over 2% for those who experienced a traumatic event. A representative community sample in Brazil of young adults found a prevalence of PTSD of 2.1%, which was higher among women and those lower in socioeconomic status. PTSD was strongly related to anxiety disorders, depression, drug abuse, smoking, suicide risk, and lower quality of life in all domains. A World Health Organization survey of over 70,000 people across 26 populations across the globe found an overall prevalence of PTSD of 3.9%, which was almost doubled for people exposed to significant traumatic events. Younger age, being female, being unmarried, being less educated, and lower socioeconomic status were all associated with higher risk of PTSD. Lifetime prevalence was relatively lower in Peru, Mexico, and Colombia than in Brazil. In regard to stress specifically in the workplace, the World Health Organization cites research finding that high job demands make workers 7 times more likely to experience emotional exhaustion and high job strain, which increases the risk of mortality threefold. They estimate that globally, occupational deaths, diseases, and illnesses account for an estimated loss of 4% of the gross domestic product. In Latin America, for example, they find that work-related stress is acknowledged as one of the big epidemics of modern working life. Finally, there is evidence that workplace stress is increasing. A global study by Regis Group, a management consulting organization, found that almost half of all workers surveyed believed that their stress levels had risen over the past year. In China, 75% indicated rising stress levels, and in 41% of Brazilians and 43% of Mexicans believed their stress levels had increased. When asked whether their job was a major cause of their stress in the past year, on average, 60% believed their job was a major cause, with 73% of Chinese, 55% of Brazilians, and 75% of Mexicans agreeing. In summary, stress evolved with our species as an adaptive mechanism to enhance our ability to compete successfully in our environment. However, stress comes at a cost when not managed competently, and these costs are both extensive and increasing in our society. Thank you.